Shwmae a chroeso I Sgwrs, podlediad Consortiwm Canolbarth y De. Yn y podlediad hwn byddwch chi'n clywed y trafodaethau diweddara am bob math o bethau addysg. Hello and welcome to Sgwrs, the Central South Consortium podcast. In this podcast we'll bring you the very latest discussions on all things education.
Hello and welcome to Qers, the podcast series from Central South Consortium. My name is Joanne Nichols and I'm the lead practitioner for science at the Central South Consortium. I'm also the leader of learning for science at Aberdare Community School. In this podcast episode, I'm again joined by my secondary colleagues from several schools across Central South, and we're going to discuss scientific literacy across biology, chemistry and physics in this episode. I'd like to start off by saying that I think we're quite fortunate in my school in that we teach the separates. We teach biology, chemistry, physics. We also then we teach double award, we teach applied double, we teach single, applied, and staff teach within their discipline, within that qualification as well. We're very lucky, in terms of having a good pool of staff, which I know is not always the case for everybody. I'm very fortunate about that, because I feel that, the physicists know their stuff, the chemists know their stuff, and the biologists, certainly know their stuff too. So for me, I think that's great having specialist teachers. I can be quite indulgent about that, and nobody really teaches outside their discipline. Of course, there's some disadvantages of that as well. One of the things we hinted at talking about in our previous episode was that we would be looking at QERs in this episode, and the difference that we've seen between them. We've spoken a little bit in the previous episode as well about continuous exposure to the QERs, as well as other examination style questions. And again, we're talking about what works for our pupils. We've talked about, haven't we, Paul, you produce a rubric that is more generic. We've talked about peer assessing that, sharing the mark schemes, self-assessing. But I think the QER element, again, Dale, looking at item level data is something that still, after all this time, requires further training, doesn't it, and exposure for our pupils. So I don't know, Beth, if you'd like to kick us off with what goes on in physics QERs.
Okay, so the physics ones tend to be a lot more applied. So they'll give you lots of information, and it could be an experiment, it could be mathematical data, it could be anything, but it could be insulation data, and then they ask you to sort of apply it to a different situation. So it's a little bit difficult, we've compared to the applied, where I've done QERs with biology, chemistry ones, and more so there's a massive contrast between the physics and the biology, where the biology is very sort of key term focused and making sure that they've got that sort of area covered, whereas the physics is now take this knowledge and put it elsewhere. So when I got to Archbishop 6 years ago, our item level data showed that pretty much 80% of our children either didn't attempt the QERs or scored 1 or 2 marks on them, where they just didn't know how to apply it. So from there, we built in meaningful marking tasks. So we don't necessarily mark every single section of their book. We only mark sort of focused pieces of work, and lots of these are our QERs, so that we can give detailed, meaningful responses, and then their dirt time can focus on something that's actually going to improve their outcomes. We've been doing a lot of making every lesson count, and so modelling and putting up past paper questions, QERs. I'm doing generating electricity with Year 9 at the moment, and so we had QER comparing coal and wind. So we put up on the board a big grid of advantages and disadvantages of each, and we got the children to feedback, and then we structured a QER together and we built through it that way. And that seems to have massively improved their confidence and improved their ability to perform in the exams.
Yeah, and I think that QERs themselves over the lifespan of the course have changed, haven't they, as well? You know, they've evolved as well, because I think that very much so at their inception, it was, you know, big piece of A4 paper, and then at the top it was, you know, compare, for example, the two types of respiration. I'm thinking about a biology example. Whereas they tend to have evolved now, where we've now got different types. You know, we were looking at one yesterday with year 9. We're like you, Beth. We start year 9, you know, start the teaching of GCSE in year 9, and we were looking at when it was about providing a cheek cell sample. So there was a picture of all the apparatus that would be used, and then they had to, you know, I think absolutely it is describe how the apparatus pictured would be used to obtain a sample of cheek cells, which is much more user friendly. You know, granted it was on the foundation paper, but much more user friendly than that kind of, you know, compare the two types of respiration, you know, and you're going to look at it and go, oh, you know, I think, you know, we've all had at the inception of the QERs that white fright that we call, you know, where pupils have either, like you said, attempted it poorly or not attempted them at all. And I think then, you know, it's great that the WJEC have evolved then to produce these different types, which I think, you know, being fortunate enough to see not just biology papers, but chemistry and physics. I think in physics, and certainly in chemistry, Dale and Hannah, that scaffolding was always perhaps there because of the nature of your science. Dale, what's your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think with chemistry, one of the things with the QERs is that, you know, they tend to be a lot of state and describe questions, because they're describing the bonding or the atomic structure or something like that, especially on the foundation papers. And I think people forget that you can describe an atom by drawing an atom. I don't think they have to write about it because it's got all the lines and stuff like that. So it's about building up that. We did a bit of an audit in the department a couple of months ago, sort of for all the past papers, just to see what the command words are and what the themes were for across all three sciences, because we teach in separate sciences as well. And sort of surprised me was the number of explain questions in physics. The most explained questions, especially in double award, were all in physics, because I guess they're applying that detail and going back to our item level data from a few years ago. The physics QERs were the ones that were the suffering the most, if you like. So that's definitely something that, you know, we are working on at the moment and trying to come up with mnemonics and strategies to help the students when they're in those exams.
Yeah, and Hannah, what's your kind of strategy down in Mountain Ash to, you know, tackle these QERs and make them a success? I know we have previously talked about in a previous episode how we approach them, but with the pupils. But you know, what has been your experience really of the different types and how you would approach those?
Well, in the beginning, when we first encountered QERs, the biology department decided it was their little area because it was more wordy. So the biology department, again, we teach in separate disciplines. So the biology department organised a series of lessons which they built quite a number of the QERs into the lessons, which then was spread throughout the science department. So we've picked up the same scaffolding as the biology department use. So one of the things we use is Custard. So we use the acronyms Custard to build the scaffolding for the QERs. But now, because they are, like you said, across the department with different types of QERs, some of the one of the scaffoldings we use now is the exploded questions. So say what information you have, followed by the explain or whatever the question says in afterwards. So we've got a bank of those resources. So we are building up the resources as we go along to tackle quite a number of the QERs.
I'm intrigued by the acronym Custard. Would you like to elaborate a little more on that?
Of course I will. I've picked this up from a school in Cardiff, and they start with circle the command words. So see, underline any keywords, scribe anything useful, anything extra you want to add. Try to make sense of all those keywords, account for all parts of the question, and then obviously read through, make sure you've answered all the parts, make sure it full sentences, capital letters, full stops, etc. And don't rush it. Remember now, it's a 6 marks question, so you should be spending about 6 to 8 minutes on this question. So that's what Custard stands for.
Oh, I think we were all furiously then as you were telling them, we all got our post-it notes right now, circle, underline. I think that's great though, isn't it? And that's a really good, I think if you've got talking about exploding Custard as well down there, Hannah, that's great, isn't it? But I think that, I think absolutely what you said is that, there are, remember, 6 to 8 minutes to answer this, and very much, certainly, with recent PPEs or, if anybody's done endotopic tests, that some pupils will spend some of their spare time doing fantastic artwork, maybe on the back of their paper or on the front of their paper, when that certainly could have been much better spent, spending that time trying to Custard a QER. Paul?
Yes, a few things I've picked up on. So currently in our school, we don't teach separate sciences. We don't have specialities. We want to move towards that. But so we all, as science teachers, experience the different types of QERs. And one of the things that Bethan said about her marking in her school is what I'm pushing for really in our department, that there should be more focus on the key tasks, and the QER is definitely a key task within a topic. And I talked in a previous podcast about the rubric, the general literacy rubric we use for QER, so students build up an understanding of how they would go about answering a question, particularly with focusing on the SPAG, the spelling, punctuation and grammar. I'd never heard of Custard before, but I think we do something similar, but maybe not quite so complicated. We just encourage them to produce a mini plan. So the mini plan is just to, once they've read the question, to work out what the key words are that they would want to include in that answer, then try and construct some sentences with those keywords that relate to the question, and then put them in a sensible order, and then add the connectives. So trying to have some sort of system. So I'm certainly going to adopt Custard moving forward, because that's much more structured than perhaps we currently do. And then in terms of a literacy focus, we use a QER question as within the school. We like every department has to have a redraft, a piece of work that students redraft. So once we've marked it, they've self-marked it, they get an opportunity then to redraft it, to improve the spelling, improve the punctuation, think about whether the scientific content is accurate, and improve that. So that's the approach that we take with QERs.
And I think very much we're going to discuss in another podcast, another episode, about literacy across the school. Because I think, and particularly scientific literacy across the school, because I think, our colleagues in other departments that we very rarely get to see and share good practice with, I'm sure, would be very familiar with that idea of drafting and redrafting a piece of work, and, wanting that skill to come to science, to make science a success, and building in the time to do that, isn't it? Because I think we're often guilty of, right, we've tried that, okay, let's move on, that's what you've got to do next time. Whereas where perhaps, you know, we've got that luxury, Bethan, of starting in year 9, you know, that you can focus on, you know, those lessons because of the content, but also the skills aspect as well. You can really, you know, drill down into, can't you? You know, you've got that time to do that drafting and redrafting, because we are guilty in science, I think, but we'll talk about later on, of accepting, and somebody mentioned it in an earlier podcast, of the odd one-word answer or, you know, one sentence, you know, so you know, to say, well, no, actually in science you do have to write quite a hefty chunk of text to explain something as well, is a concept that, you know, perhaps we should be introducing much lower down, you know, the school. I think all of us, you know, we're perhaps nodding a little bit, you know, we've talked about using, you know, past paper questions at foundation, lower down the school for that exposure. Maybe it's something QERs that we could introduce lower down the school as well, you know, to train them up from the start that maybe, yeah, science isn't just about short word responses, because we do inquiries at Key Stage 3, which encourage, doesn't it, that longer and extended writing. But it might be that we can drip feed QERs in lower down the school as well to increase that exposure. Dale?
Yeah, we've started doing that and been using structure strips. So actually giving them the 6-mark question at the top, and then we've given them a series of, say, 4 or 5 sub-questions to answer. So lower down the school, they find that much easier to access. So you've already broken that down for them. And of course, the goal would be that they could start to do that themselves over time and build up that independence. And I know one of my colleagues is sort of doing a little bit of research into that and whether or not that's something that we could roll out further on. It does take a bit of time. So again, it's better at Key Stage 3. You wouldn't necessarily be able to give the time to be writing these sub-questions and developing that at Key Stage 4 perhaps. But if that's already embedded in their heads, then when they're approaching these 6-mark QERs, they can start to think of that process through.
Yeah, and I think that, like we said as well, you know, exposing them to the different types of QER, you know, not just across biology, chemistry, physics, but the fact that there are those different types where they would appear sometimes to be slightly more scaffolding, or like you said, Hannah, you know, can you custard this? Are there key terms in that, you know, in that start? Is there anything in there that you can use? And you know, I mean, I think that in a previous podcast, you know, that there, of course, is more to literacy in biology, chemistry, physics than just the QERs. And we have discussed those previously, but very much, I think, you know, I think we all agree, looking at item level data, that this is definitely something as it stays and evolves that we do have to tackle, don't we? And we do have to make a success. Paul, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of once they've done a QER, Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, it's trying to build in a DIRT activity that follows it, so that that is their opportunity to redraft. And obviously marking is, I talked about marking and focusing on particular tasks, and sometimes, and if they've done a QER, it can be possible, as long as it's not necessarily the next day, if it's a couple of days away, to get that QER marked for them when they come back. So that's what we aim for. Sometimes it's a challenge because there are 101 other things obviously to do, but if they can get that fairly sharp immediate feedback and then redraft it builds their resilience and confidence then when the next time they try one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's been a very interesting, worthwhile discussion about the good practice that's going on across the schools. Thank you very much for listening and for joining us, and more episodes to come.
Diolch am wrando ar y benod hon o Sgwrs. Cofiwch ein dilyn ar Twitter a Facebook, tanysgrifio ein sianel YouTube, ymuno yn cymunedau ar ein gwefan a darllen ein bwletin ysgolion wythnosol am y newyddion diweddaraf. Thanks for listening to this episode of Sgwrs. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, Join our online communities via our website and read our weekly school bulletin for the latest news. Hwyl am y tro. Bye for now.